Hi everyone, and welcome to Jung and Dreams. This is the free introductory module on Jung and Dreams entitled Theory and Practice. My name is Dr. James Newell, and I want to thank you for joining us. In this class, we're going to talk about what is probably the most important aspect of applying Jung's psychological theory. That is, the practice of Jungian dream interpretation. Now, the reason dream interpretation is so important to understanding Jung's work is that Jung's basic techniques for understanding and interpreting dreams are applicable to all of the other areas of study that he pursued. Whether interpreting active imagination fantasies, cultural phenomena such as mythology, fairy tales, religion, or alchemy, Jung employed essentially the same basic interpretive methods that he used in interpreting dreams. Really, one of the reasons that many intellectuals will dismiss Jung's work is because they fail to understand and are unable to follow his study of the psyche, because he employs methods such as introspection, free association, amplification, and an intuitive approach, which is the same approach that he uses for interpreting dreams. He uses this in all of these different areas. And when someone is reading what they expect to be a sort of a logical progression of an academic argument, and suddenly Jung lapses into free association and amplification, to them it seems like a digression. But in fact, Jung is applying these same methods that he uses for interpreting dreams, because this is how the unconscious works. Usually intellectuals and academic studies focus on cognitive processes that are conscious. They're not dealing with the unconscious and paying much attention to the unconscious. Jung is completely interested in making this connection with the unconscious, and that is, of course, what the study of dreams is all about. So, additionally, in order to fully understand and appreciate Jung's approach to the psyche and his method of interpreting dreams, one needs to have an understanding of Jung's view of the psyche, and few intellectuals have any such understanding, and few take the trouble to learn. But that's what we're going to do today. In this module, we're going to start out with just a little review of Jung's theory. Of course, the best way to fully grasp Jung's theory will be to take the Jung 101 and the Jung 102 introductory courses. However, for now, what we're going to do is just review some of Jung's key ideas, and hopefully that will give us sort of a leg up to understanding what he's doing with his particular methods of dream interpretation. So, in general, when we look at Jung's work overall, central to his understanding of the psyche, central to understanding his theory, is to be aware of Jung's guiding assumptions. That will help us to understand the reasoning behind the method that he employs. So some of these guiding assumptions include introspection. Jung's method requires looking within oneself. Again, this is counter to a lot of mainstream intellectual academic thought, because typically we want things to be objective, not subjective. When you're dealing with the unconscious, it's exactly the opposite. We want to get into the subjective responses of the unconscious. So introspection is central to what Jung is doing. Secondly, he divides the unconscious into a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious. That is, the personal unconscious is that layer of the unconscious which is specific to the individual, and the collective unconscious is not a sea of psychic mystical connections between people. There are implications for that, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a biologically evolved system in the central nervous system that is similar. Just as we all have 4 fingers and a thumb, typically, not everyone, but typically we have 2 arms, we have a nose in the middle of the face, 2 eyes. That's the structure of the human anatomy. Similarly, there's a structure to the deep unconscious, and that's another assumption of Jung's, is that there is a structure to the psyche, not just the collective unconscious, but even within the unconscious there's specific structures, and we'll get into some of the specifics of that. Again, Jung 101 covers all of that in more detail. But through these structures flows for Jung, another guiding assumption, is that through these structures flows psychic energy. This is what Freud called libido. For Freud, libido was only sexual energy. For Jung, psychic energy, not psychic like the psychic hotline or clairvoyance or anything like that. Psychic simply means of the psyche, of the central nervous system, you could say. So this energy flowing through the central nervous system activates different structures within the deep unconscious, and sometimes it is this flowing energy, it will be blocked by the complexes. There'll be a complex which ceases the immediate flow of that energy. This is why another guiding assumption is that complexes are central to Jung's theory, the idea that there are both conscious and unconscious complexes. Their complexes are not necessarily bad. There are complexes that are functional complexes. The ego is a complex. The persona, it can be a functional complex as long as we're conscious of it, etc. There's the shadow complex. There's a number of, there can be a father complex, a mother complex. Whether it's positive or negative depends on whether or not it's interfering with our conscious activities, our conscious intention, our conscious will. Now, Jung says that the complex is really counter to what Freud said. Freud said that the royal road to the unconscious is dreams, and Jung certainly agreed with that. But he also said the royal road to the unconscious is not the dream, as Freud thought, but the complex, which is the architect of dreams and of symptoms. So he's saying, yes, with Freud, that the dreams are important, but that the complex is what structures the dream. And we could say that the complex, the dream rather, is actually almost like a photograph of the complex. So when we can understand the dream properly, we will have a better understanding of the operative complex in a person's life. So for Jung, the goal of analysis or the goal of therapy is to establish an ongoing relationship between the conscious and unconscious systems of the psyche. He called this process the process of individuation. This is also the goal of Jungian dream work. So the goal of Jungian dream work is to help to connect and maintain this connection between the conscious and unconscious systems. So, of course, and I kind of raced through that. I hope I didn't go too fast. You can always go back and listen to that again. But what I just said begs the question, in general, what is individuation? Well, individuation is the word that Jung used to describe the differentiation. Differentiation is a key word here. Differentiation means the separation of the conscious ego from the unconscious self. As Jung says, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. So there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, Jung mentions the persona on the one hand and primordial images on the other. Now, this diagram that you see is what we might call a metaphorical representation of the Jungian psyche. If we cut open the human brain, we would not see an ego or a persona or a collective unconscious, etc. Still, these are structures of the psyche that can be discerned when we study the psyche through subjective reflection or the behavior of others, or especially in the manifestations of the psyche in dreams and fantasy material. We see the ego at the center there in this diagram, floating within what William James might call the stream of consciousness. And below that, we see a line demarcating consciousness from unconscious. We see a representation of the archetype of the self, straddling both a personal and a collective unconscious. So, according to Jung, human beings must negotiate two objective realms. The first is the realm of outer objects, and the second is the realm of inner objects. Outer objects include our families, communities, the people and things that we see in our outer social environment. As we go through the developmental stages into adulthood, we develop a kind of a mask by which we represent ourselves to the family, to the social group, and to the world at large. Jung called this mask the persona. The persona includes only those things that we want people to know about us, and those things which we don't want people to know about us, we hide and let eventually fall into the unconscious, into what Jung has called the shadow. We'll have more to say about the shadow later, but the important point is that a part of the individuation process includes the development of this persona and learning how to function with a cohesive sense of self, a cohesive identity, functioning in the world, the outer world of social events, people and things, and being able to survive and hopefully thrive. That's, we could say, the first stage of the individuation process. Now, the other realm that we must learn to negotiate is the inner realm of the collective unconscious, which is populated by the archetypes, what Jung called the archetypes. Although we do not actually see the archetypes, we experience them as powerful fields of energy, and we see them as what Jung calls primordial images, which arise from the unconscious. So when Jung says that the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other, he is saying that the aim of individuation is to learn how to negotiate these two realms in a way that is healthy, that is life-affirming, and that is generative. The goal, as we move through this process, is essentially one of making the unconscious conscious. In the early stages, we are not aware of our unconscious ideas and impressions, and we project them onto outer objects. As we see in this diagram, the unconscious is projected into something that is unknown to us, and so we try to take something. It's sort of an anxiety response, trying to identify something that's unknown, so we project something from the unconscious that we feel we do know, and this is a defense mechanism. Freud identified it and called it projection, and Jung heartily endorsed this idea and used the same idea many, many times. So Jung's definition of individuation means that we must first cease to identify completely with the persona, the mask that we show to the outer world, and integrate back into consciousness the shadow material that we've rejected when we were constructing our persona. If we do not integrate it back, we will unconsciously project that shadow material into objects in the outer world. The second step of the individuation process is to reconnect with the deep unconscious and to learn to regulate the archetypal energies and to not be overwhelmed by them. So we could say that the first phase of the individuation process is the building up of the sense of self, a sense of identity. We find a place in the world, we learn to function in the world, and in the process of accomplishing this, we build the persona, which necessarily leaves out certain parts of our personality which fall into the shadow. The second phase of the process of individuation involves reconnecting with and integrating the shadow, and as this is accomplished, we encounter more and varied archetypal energies, or primordial images. Our relationship with these archetypal energies is important because if we avoid them, we experience a sense of alienation from our own life energy, and yet if we surrender to them, we may become unconsciously possessed by the archetypal energies. We become inflated in a way that can be dangerous in a variety of ways. Well, in order to illustrate this second phase of the individuation process, Jung introduced the idea of the myth of the hero, which is characterized by the tendency of the ego to descend into the unconscious in order to access the libido, that is the psychic energy that is available through the archetypes. And usually this is necessary because there's been some blockage of this energy, blockage of the archetypal energy by a complex. Now, Jungian Erich Neumann puts it this way. He says, quote, "In the process of realizing and assimilating an unconscious content, the ego makes a descent from the conscious standpoint into the depths in order to raise up the treasure." Close quote. So this is using sort of a metaphor of the myth of the hero to show, and the hero's journey, to show how the ego has to descend and connect with the unconscious and the unconscious energies. Now, this diagram should be familiar to anyone who's familiar with the work of Joseph Campbell. Campbell was following Jung. Jung introduced the idea of the hero's journey in his book, Symbols of Transformation. Campbell picked up on this and sort of systematized it a little bit more. But this idea of a call to adventure, a refusal of the call, meeting of a mentor, crossing the threshold, something happens, maybe one gets fired, gets a divorce, or just stubs your toe, or you have an automobile accident, and this is sort of we can see this as a terrible thing, or we can see it as a call to adventure, and it causes us to look at what unconscious thing is coming up and causing these apparently negative things to be happening. And this is a sort of a symbolic way of looking at this as the hero's journey. Of course, Campbell and Jung both are saying that in our ongoing the human history, the stories about heroes have helped people to negotiate this need to go back and reconnect with the deep unconscious, and the hero's journey represents this in a metaphorical way. Now, the idea of this is that, as we see with this diagram, every time we go down into the unconscious, connect, and become a little bit more conscious, the ego differentiates. Remember, I said the word differentiation is very important. The ego differentiates from the unconscious. And as you see here in figure 1, the ego is completely enveloped in the unconscious self. Figure 2, there's a little bit of differentiation. Figure 3, there's a little more differentiation. The goal is for the ego to be completely differentiated from the unconscious while still maintaining this connection with the deep unconscious. That's the ego self-axis. If we were to differentiate without that connection, that would be dissociation, and that could lead to very, very bad things psychologically. So we want to always maintain this ego self-axis through dream work, active imagination. We can do it through spiritual disciplines of various types. Throughout human history, people usually have engaged in religious practices in order to maintain this ego self-axis. Now, that's looking at it metaphorically. The dangers we face on the hero's journey emerge when we fail to face and deal with the challenges arising from the unconscious. When we fail to develop the skills involved in managing our complexes through establishing a dialogue with the unconscious, we risk falling prey to either an identification with the archetypal energies, which causes anxiety and anxiety disorders, or an alienation from archetypal energies, which causes depression or depressive disorders. Now, either of these states, identification or alienation, can lead to a host of diagnosable neuroses. Now, as I say, what we have been looking at is looking at the myth metaphorically through the hero's journey. Now, this diagram shows, conversely, the translation of the metaphorical ideas into psychological language. Jung said when interpreting a dream or interpreting a fairy tale or interpreting a myth, we always need to be able at some point to, if we're going to understand it psychologically, we need to ground it in hard psychological, cognitively sound language. And this is what this is a diagram from Edward Edinger, where he talks about there's this idea of just being in a generally a place of wholeness, a place of recognizing that who I am, what I am. With that comes just a little bit of inflation. Now, if that inflation is allowed to get out of control, we see this over here, it says active inflation. We become inflated as we become a little bit too ego-driven. We think we can do more than we actually can do, and we do some inflated or heroic act, which ends up, as I say, in divorce or in losing our job or having a car accident or getting drunk in the wrong situation or any host of other things, which causes this rejection by society, causes us to fall below that line, We're alienated from this sense. We thought we knew who we were and what we were, and now we're alienated from that sense of self. We're alienated from the archetypal energies. We experience complete humiliation and complete, they say you have to hit rock bottom in the 12-step programs. Well, this is rock bottom. But once we're down at rock bottom, we have a sense of who we actually are, what we are actually capable of. And if we can take that energy, if we can contact that archetypal energy and bring it back up, like with the hero's journey, bring it back up into consciousness, back up into our daily lives, then we're back into this state of being identified with the reality of what actual archetypal energies are available to us. Now, when we do that, when we're dialoguing with and remaining in communication with the unconscious through dream work, we can regulate and steward these powerful archetypal energies. And if we do not do that, we, again, become identified with the energies and think we're in control of them. And then we go back through this cycle of being inflated and creating problems for ourselves. And also, often as a result of being inflated, we then become alienated from our own life energies and fall into a depression. Now, the idea with this other diagram is that this is a cyclical process that we go through over and over and over again, and each time we go through that process, we develop more skills and we differentiate the ego a little bit more, until we learn the skills of having an ego self-axis and we have a functioning way of regulating these archetypal energies. Now, before we begin to review what we'll be covering in the 8-week Jung and Dreams course, I would like to say a little bit more about complexes. Complexes are an extremely important aspect of Jungian dream work. As I say, it's like the dream itself is a photograph or a representation of some kind of the complex. So in general, we could say that Jung felt that each dream provides us with a picture, a representation of a complex that is trying to become more conscious. So let's return for a moment to that quote that we read earlier, where Jung says, "The royal road to the unconscious, however, is not the dream, as Freud thought, but the complex, which is the architect of dreams and of symptoms." Close quote. So that quote and the following quote are both from Jung's 1934 essay, A Review of the Complex Theory, which I highly recommend. Excellent way to understand his general sense of what a complex is, where it comes from, and how it can be resolved. So Jung says, quote, "Everyone knows nowadays that people have complexes. What is not so well known, though far more important theoretically, is that complexes can have us. The existence of complexes throws serious doubt on the naive assumption of the unity of consciousness, which is equated with psyche, and on the supremacy of the will." What he's saying here is that the will does not always the will does not always have its way, because sometimes the complex has its way. He says every constellation of a complex postulates a disturbed state of consciousness. The unity of consciousness is disrupted, and the intentions of the will are impeded or made impossible. Even memory is often noticeably affected, as we have seen. The complex must therefore be a psychic factor which, in terms of energy, possesses a value that sometimes exceeds that of our conscious intentions. Otherwise, such disruptions of the conscious order would not be possible at all. Close quote. So what he's saying is that when this unresolved energetic issue in the unconscious has a value, an energy value, that is greater than the energy of my intention. I have a certain intention to do something, and I can do it. It's typical that someone will go through the workday, they've got this energy to do the work, everything is fine, but as soon as they get home, that intention of the will begins to fade and the energy of the complex takes over, and maybe they they beat their wife, or they get drunk, or they go out and do crazy things in the nighttime, and then they get their will back and go to work, and they're able to be functional on the job. But when they're at home, they can't be, because they can't maintain that willpower always. At some point, the energy of the complex takes over. Now, from the same essay, let's look at Jung's somewhat more technical definition of the complex. This gets into kind of the nuts and bolts from a psychological perspective. He says, quote, "What then, scientifically speaking, is a feeling-toned complex? It is the image of a certain psychic situation which is strongly accentuated emotionally and is, moreover, incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. This image has a powerful inner coherence. It has its own wholeness and, in addition, a relatively high degree of autonomy, so that it is subject to the control of the conscious mind to only a limited extent, and therefore behaves like an animated foreign body in the sphere of consciousness." So it's autonomous, means it operates on its own, not in any way subservient to my intention or my will. He goes on, "The complex can usually be suppressed with an effort of will, but not argued out of existence, and at the first suitable opportunity it reappears in all its original strength." Close quote. And as I say, this is like the case of someone who can function fine during the day, but as soon as they kind of let down their guard, they have not been able to argue the complex out of existence. It simply has been kept in abeyance, and then all of a sudden it comes out with its full force, as Jung says. Another excellent definition of the complex comes from the Israeli Jungian analyst named Errol Shalit. He has an excellent book called The Complex: Path of Transformation from Archetype to Ego, published by Inner City Books. And in that definition he says, quote, "Complex denotes a network of associations, images, ideas, memories, or the like, clustered around a nuclear archetypal core of meaning and characterized and held together by a common emotional tone. Thus, the complex embodies three elements: an archetypal core, around which personal experiences cluster, and an emotional tone that serves as the gravitational force that holds this microcosm together." Close quote. So that's I think, a wonderful summary of Jung's idea of the complex. And what happens is, if we look at it in this way, the way Shalit has described it, the complex is like an onion. As we work on complexes, we peel away one layer at a time until we get to the core. From this perspective, we will first encounter symptoms. Next, we'll encounter personal experiences, often related to an early trauma. This generates that feeling tone that they describe. And then finally, we'll reach the archetypal core. And why an archetypal core? Because all of these complexes are around common human experiences. At the core, there's nothing unique. Everybody, or rather, we all have the same central nervous system, and so throughout the millennia, millions and millions of years, people have had similar types of patterns of blocks just like this, and that will be reflected in an archetype. And the archetype at the core, when it's freed, means lots of energy will be freed, and when we can sort of manage that and regulate that energy, that's when we begin to have a lot more energy for our life's work and the goals that we're trying to accomplish. So that's just a sort of a summary of the importance of the complex, because again, when we're looking at dreams, when we're doing dream interpretation, we're basically trying to discern what type of complex, where is the complex manifesting, how is this relating to the person's life. This is sort of the central theme of Jungian dream interpretation, is identifying and teasing apart and resolving, working through complexes so we can free up that energy and make it available to us in our daily lives. So that's all of that is sort of a general survey of key elements of Jung's theory, the centrality of the complex in terms of dream interpretation. And what I want to do now is just go over a couple ways to approach dream interpretation from a Jungian perspective, and then we'll get on to talking about exactly what we'll cover in this course on Jung and Dreams. So it's a little bit tricky to talk about specific techniques of dream interpretation when you're talking about Jung, because Jung was never in favor of systematizing his work. He always preferred to be in the moment and only applied techniques that responded to the specific case that he was considering. He was very much spontaneous about the way he did it and did not want to let theory override what was actually happening in front of him with the person that he was consulting with. Even so, he did offer many suggestions for successful dream interpretation. And he says, in regard to interpreting dreams, quote, "No experienced worker in this field will deny that there are rules of thumb that can prove helpful, but they must be applied with prudence and intelligence. Not everybody can master the technique. You may follow all the right rules and the apparently safe path of knowledge, and yet you get stuck in the most appalling nonsense, simply by overlooking a seemingly unimportant detail that a better intelligence would not have missed. Even a man with a highly developed intellect can go badly astray because he has never learnt to use his intuition or his feeling, which might be at a regrettably low level of development," close quote. And this again is what I was talking about earlier, where mainstream academic intellectuals will, as a matter of course, disregard intuition, disregard feeling, because they want to be objective, not subjective. When you're dealing with the psyche, when you're dealing with human emotion, when you're dealing with human beings, you can't disregard those things. You need to be able to use your discerning intellect. We're not talking about throwing away the intellect, but it has to work in tandem. With Jung, there are 4 functions: thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation. And ideally, with dream interpretation, all 4 of those sensations, all 4 of those functions should be employed. The whole person is going to be able to be both extroverted and introverted and use all of those 4 functions. So Jung goes on to say, quote, "Intuition is almost indispensable in the interpretation of symbols and can cause an immediate acceptance on the part of the dreamer. But one can understand and explain only when one has brought intuitions down to the safe basis of real knowledge of the facts and their logical connections," close quote. So even a basic how-to of Jungian dream interpretation must be viewed with some suspicion, since for Jung, each case must be examined individually in the context of the situation, of the dreamer's life, and of a host of other very specific individual factors. With these caveats in mind, and there's a lot of caveats there, let's take a look at some accepted rules of thumb as a starting point for approaching the interpretation of dreams in a way that Jung, we hope, might feel would be acceptable. Now, so to start out, I want to look at something from a wonderful book, James Hall's 1983 book, Jungian Dream Interpretation, A Handbook of Theory and Practice. This also is published by Inner City Books. It provides an excellent place to begin thinking about Jungian dream interpretation. In some ways, you could say that Hall's book is a kind of Cliff Notes introduction to many of the basics of Jungian dream work. So, according to Hall, quote, "There are 3 major steps in the Jungian approach to dream interpretation. The first, a clear understanding of the exact details of the dream. Second, is the gathering of associations and amplifications in progressive order on one or more of 3 levels. And those 3 levels are A, the personal level, B, the cultural level, and C, the archetypal level. And then finally, number 3, the placing of the amplified dream in the context of the dreamer's life situation and process of individuation." Now, an important thing I just want to mention here is he mentions amplification, associations and amplification. And we'll get a lot more into amplification, not only in this course, but really the rest of the whole series of courses covers ways that Jung amplified dreams and fantasies and other things. And amplification simply means drawing parallels between, for example, a dream image. If there's an owl in my dream, what myths are there about owls? What fairy tales are there about owls? What stories are there about owls that I can draw on and see, amplify, try to tease out what the meaning in this context, in the context of my dream, what that meaning might be. As an association would be about, oh, that reminds me of my mother, it reminds me of my father, whatever that might be. Amplification is different. It's on a cultural level, on a collective unconscious, archetypal level. How does this archetype appear in other ways in human history? We'll get a lot more into amplification, but that's a very important central part of the Jungian dream method of interpretation, and leave it at that for now, but we'll get a lot more into that. So that for us is kind of an outline of the basics of Jung's psychological theory, the basics of the structure of the Jungian psyche, how energy moves through the system, what the process of individuation is, why it's important, and what is the role of dreams in working through that process. That idea really has to do with the hero's journey. The dream work is kind of like a heroic work where we're going down and trying to bring up the treasure from the unconscious. We've also looked at some specific techniques for interpreting dreams from the Jungian perspective, drawing on James Hall. So what I want to do now is just talk about what we're going to be doing in this upcoming course. Obviously, there's much more to both the theory, Jung's theory, and to the technique of Jungian dream work and how that works with the theory. Jung wrote volumes and volumes on dreams, and he held many seminars. The notes of many of these have been published. Some are yet to be published. Much of his work with myth, alchemy, fairy tales, etc. was with the aim of helping him to amplify dream images and symbols. Remember, I said amplification is about finding cross-cultural references. It'll help us to understand broader meanings in our dreams. That's all his work with myth, alchemy, fairy tales, all of that was really trying to understand this, what he called a structured, deep unconscious. And again, we'll get more into that as we go along. Much of this work will be discussed in our 8-week course on Jung and Dreams. If you decide to enroll in the Jung and Dreams course, you can simply audit the course by viewing the video classes and working with the supplementary materials. Or if you decide that you'd like to earn the course certificate of completion, you will then need to purchase a copy of the course textbook. And the course textbook is a wonderful book, Dreams, A Portal to the Source, by Edward Whitmont and Sylvia Brinton Pereira. It's a superb book. It's been used as a textbook for the training of Jungian analysts. It's both comprehensive and it's really very enjoyable to read. So it's worth it, whether you want to get the certificate or not. It's worth it to read this book if you're interested in Jung and his work with dreams. So let's just look at now a survey of what we're going to actually cover in the course. And I think this is, even if you're not planning to take the course, I think you'll learn a lot just from the way we're going to cover it, what we're going to cover, and of course we'll go into a lot more detail when we get to the courses. So, when we get to the modules. And starting out, of course, with Module 1, we're going to start out with a history of dream interpretation. In this module, we'll review the history of dream interpretation in human culture and see how ancient practices compare to Jung's use of dreams and dream interpretation. See, dreams, it's not something new. A lot of people, because it's not something new and because it's associated with many, many religious practices and mythological systems going way, way back in history, when Freud first published in The Interpretation of Dreams, people were they thought this isn't very scientific. Again, we're dealing with an introspective, subjective way of thinking about things. This is not what academics like. They want to be objective. They want to be very intellectual and sort of separate from what's being studied. You can't really do that when you're dealing with something like the psyche, when you're dealing with consciousness, when you're dealing with personal development, or simply treating emotional disorder. So people were very suspicious about dreams, but Jung often used to say that he wanted to be able to ground the work that he did in, you could say, ancient practices. There had to be some sort of a mythological human root. Why? Because there has to be some correspondence with the collective unconscious. There has to be an ongoing connection with the deep unconscious. So how Jung is very interested in the history of dreams, the ancient practices of dream interpretation. We're going to just spend the whole first module looking at both Jung's interest in this and just how this played out through history. Now, the earliest known recorded use of dream interpretation can be found in what is generally regarded as the oldest existing human literature, which is the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. Since that time, there have been countless examples of dream interpretation recorded in ancient texts, and usually in a religious context. Now, the Gilgamesh dream, Gilgamesh has some dreams. He interprets them. There are other people who interpret them. There's really learned a lot simply from that most ancient text, which is actually carved into stone. We'll talk about that, but also some of the ongoing through Greek, through native peoples around the world. Just a lot of really interesting material will be covered in this module. So for a Jungian, the religious context is important because it suggests the presence of archetypal patterns recorded in ancient documents and points to the collective unconscious. And as Jung was so found to be so important, is just the idea of grounding his work in this ancient rhizome. Rhizome just means the roots, the ancient roots of human culture and, of course, of the human psyche. So with Module 2, we're going to be looking at the science of dreams. And in this module, we'll look at how neuroscientists, biologists, and other scientists understand dreams. It's kind of the opposite of what we're looking at in the historical module. We're going to be looking kind of at the mythological and the roots of the collective unconscious aspect of dreams. Now we're going to look at it from the purely scientific realm, how scientists look at it. We'll see what aspects of the scientific study of dreams support Jung's theories and which ones do not. Surprisingly, there is a lot of support for what Jung found through introspection, not through microscopes and laboratory study, but he was able to come up with many things that scientists also recognize. Interestingly, there's a realm of things that scientists do not recognize simply because they have no mechanism to see it. Again, because they're trying to be objective, that actually eliminates some of the most important aspects of dream work. But knowing that and knowing some of the details of that will help us as we move through the course. Remarkably, given Jung's fidelity to the method of introspection in the years since his death, neuroscience has repeatedly supported a lot of his earliest findings. So although they use different, as scientists use a different approach and different terminology, sleep researchers have supported many of Jung's most important observations, and we'll get into a lot of the details of that in Module 2. Now, when we get to Module 3, that's when we really we take these two opposite background areas that we cover in Module 1 and 2, and then we can use what we've learned there to expand our understanding of Jung and dreams and what Jung actually had to say about dreams. As I said, dream work for Jung is arguably the central and most important practice for applied Jungian psychology. Throughout his lifetime, Jung continually worked on dreams. He worked on his own dreams. He worked on literally thousands and thousands of dreams, interpreted them. Throughout his lifetime, Jung wrote countless essays, conducted numerous seminars, and discussed the importance of dreams and dream interpretation throughout his work, in every aspect of his work. In this module, we're going to review Jung's body of writings on dreams and dreams work. Obviously, given that list I just mentioned, we won't be able to go into detail with every single text, but we'll take some key texts. One of the purposes of these courses is to open up a field of research. No one course can cover any of these topics that we're talking about, but what I want to do, what our goal is to open up a field of research, so when you see what the whole spectrum is of what you can learn about any of these topics, in this case Jung and Dreams, there will be certain areas, certain texts of Jung's, certain texts of people after Jung that will be of interest to you. You can then expand your research into those areas and have a good solid grounding, a rooted approach to these things, but be able to expand how you learn and what you learn by some of the things that we hope to expose you to here. Some of the, as I say, many titles, some of the essays and texts include Dreams and Psychic Energy. Remember I said psychic energy is not about clairvoyance, it means of the psyche. Dreams and how the energy of the psyche moves through the psyche, how life energy moves through the psyche. So that's Dreams and Psychic Energy. Another text is The Practical Use of Dream Analysis. Another is Individual Dream Symbolism in Relation to Alchemy. We won't get as much into that. We get actually more into that in our course on alchemy. However, we will use some of those alchemical dreams when we get into actually looking at how Jung interpreted dreams, but that'll be in another module. We'll look at dream interpretation, ancient and modern. This is another essay by Jung. We'll look at dream analysis, notes on the seminar in 1928 and 1930. Fascinating things that Jung has to say in those seminars. We'll look at Jung's seminar on children's dreams. He does say a lot about children's dreams, but he also, it's one of the few places he lays out sort of a technique that Maria Louise von Franz uses, almost the exact same technique that he describes in the seminar on dreams. She uses that in her book on the interpretation of fairy tales. So again, as I said, these things are applicable to all these other areas, and there are many more seminars and essays. These are just a sampling of some of the things that we're going to cover in this module and in all of the rest of the course. So in Module 4, we move on to really what was Jung's method of dream interpretation. And of course, he said his method was no method, but after saying that, he says what he calls rules of thumb. So in this fourth module, we'll take an in-depth look at some of the methods that Jung used in order to interpret dreams. We'll look at how dream interpretation supports the individuation process. We'll look at what specific techniques Jung employed in an effort to understand dreams. And again, that relates directly to free association, which is certainly an important part, but most important for Jung is this idea of amplification. And this is why Jungians don't just read mythology and fairy tales and alchemy because they like esoteric things. A lot of people accused Jung of being an esotericist. It really is not the case. The case is that he wanted to know how the psyche functioned, and whenever we see these sort of very numinous, very highly charged areas that are on the fringe, that are typically not treated by the scientific method, Jung was interested in this because why in this scientific age was the psyche still so compelled to go into these areas? Well, we see that he uses these patterns that emerge in these things, he uses them to amplify and to understand dreams and to understand other cultural phenomena. As we've already mentioned, Jung did not like to systematize his work, so we're not going to find a lot of systematization. Even so, both he and his students have left a number of clues as to how to get a foothold in the slippery world of dream interpretation, in the slippery world of the unconscious. We always want to keep in mind the goal of supporting and furthering the individuation process. And the problem with all of this kind of work, Jungian work in particular, the more you deal with the unconscious, the more you see it is a soup of all these energies, and we need some kind of a foothold. We need some kind of a a sense of structure. The more we know about the structure of the psyche, the more we have some kind of system, some kind of place to hold on to, the more we can maintain the direction that we're heading, moving towards the goal of individuation. We can't do that if we're just overwhelmed by the unconscious. So we need to be able to have a foothold on. That's why I say we're not jettisoning the thinking process or the thinking function, but we're also want intuition, feeling, and sensation to play a role. So we need to have some kind of a structure, and in this module, Module 4, we'll be looking at how we can do that and keep ourselves grounded as we go into the depths of the unconscious. Now, this takes us to Module 5, where we talk about dreams and mythology and how that relates. This, again, takes us into this realm of amplification. As we've already seen, key to Jung's work with dream interpretation is what he called amplification. Jung saw parallels between dream symbols and images and ancient mythologies, fairy tales, religious ideas, and a host of other human cultural artifacts. This is a module where we'll really talk in depth about amplification and how that would work in the context of working with dreams. In Module 5, we're going to examine his method of amplification. We're going to look at how Jung saw archetypal patterns appearing in myths as well as in dreams and fantasies. By tracing these patterns, Jung was able to shed light on some of the often obscure images that appear in dreams, and we'll hope to be able to see where these symbols lead and what kind of energy they may make available to us. Remember, when we're going down into the deep unconscious, when we're teasing apart the complex, when we get to that archetypal core, energy is released. We need to be prepared for that. We need to have a sort of a solid ego structure that can contain those energies. We need to be able to regulate those energies. And the way we begin to get to those energies, to locate them, is when we see the patterns, the similar patterns, through amplification. We see the patterns that appear in myths, and we're able to discern them in the dream and connect them to some meaning that makes the dreamer, remember, the dreamer is the one who has to say, aha, I get it, that's telling me something important. So that's what we're going to be looking at in Module 5. In Module 6, we're going to be looking at dreams and trauma. And the thing about trauma is that I described earlier in this module the sort of typical developmental phases of the Jungian idea of individuation. Trauma is the anomaly. Trauma interferes on that process. The trauma has to be dealt with first before we can continue on the typical individuation process. We can say probably that not all nightmares are indicative of trauma, but nightmares do carry a special significance, and most trauma survivors do report disturbing and frightening dreams that seem to carry powerful energy and a special urgency. And how we deal with trauma with ourselves or with people that we're working with is very, very important. How it's dealt with when it comes up in dreams, very, very important. Again, it can be very disrupting. This is why this first phase of the individuation process has to be emphasized, particularly with people who are survivors of trauma, because we need that strong structure. Sometimes working in a group helps that. But whatever it is, there has to be a strong container, whether it's working with an individual therapist, working in a group situation. There needs to be a container where the person can feel safe and be safe as they work through the emergence of trauma particularly we're going to be talking about the emergence of trauma in dreams. So we'll look at how historical patterns of trauma may appear in dreams, how Jung understood nightmares. We'll also consider some of the ideas of other Jungians, especially wonderful Jungian Donald Kalshed. You may be familiar with his work. We'll use his model very much in trying to understand the importance of dream images when they relate to trauma, and how trauma can interrupt the typical developmental phases of the individuation process and how the healing of trauma can help to facilitate that continuing, that ongoing individuation process. So in Module 7, we're going to look at a number of depth dream interpretation methods. And this, as I say, Jung didn't systematize dream interpretation much, but there are many Jungians who came after him who did, and others who were not clearly Jungians, but were certainly working in a depth perspective. Depth psychology, sometimes called psychodynamic psychology, simply means a type of psychology where people take the unconscious seriously, take the unconscious into consideration when they are working with individuals. And so we're going to be looking at some other depth psychologists, some other psychodynamic methods of working with dreams that I think we'll only be covering ones that I think Jung would have approved of and would have thought were useful. Since his death in 1961, many Jungians and other depth psychologists have proposed a variety of different dream interpretations, methods, and techniques. So we're going to look at some of those approaches to dream work that have been employed in an effort to expand on Jung's ideas while still remaining true to his theory. Of special interest to us will be some of the key Jungians like Marie-Louise von Franz, more modern Jungian, although he's passed away now, Robert Johnson, Anthony Stevens, Stephen Eisenstadt, and Jeremy Taylor, all people with terrific approaches, terrific techniques. We'll look at in detail. So we'll get in this module, you'll get a real sort of buffet of different dream interpretation methods, all of them related in one way or another, but with little nuances that are different. I think you'll be very happy with what we cover in this module. And then finally, in Module 8, we'll look at what Jung called big dreams, or dreams and culture. So in this module, we're going to look at dreams that express what Jung called the archetypal level of consciousness. These so-called big dreams have been recognized by people throughout history as having special cultural significance. These big dreams affect the individual and the group psyche so profoundly that they are understood to have significance for many people. In other words, if I have a dream and I dream whatever the odd dream is, it always will have some kind of significance for me. Sometimes it may have significance for people in my family, but it will always have significance for me. But usually it's not going to have significance for people in my town or people in my country or people globally. But there are some dreams which do have broad cultural significance. They hit that level. Remember we talked about complexes have an archetypal core. Well, if we hit that archetypal core, and that archetypal core happens to be something that is common, there's a situation maybe in the country I'm in or in the cultural area that I'm in where this is significant for everyone, then we call that a big dream. It's an archetypal dream, and it's a dream that will have significance for many people. There are examples of this in history, particularly among Native people. There's a wonderful story which we will spend some time on, which is the story of Black Elk. In Black Elk's Speaks, Black Elk is a Lakota holy man, and he had a dream which was significant for not just the Lakota people, but was really significant for many of the Native people, and still has significance for them. And we'll look at that. And as I say, the big dreams typically are understood to have religious significance. Again, the archetypal level tends to be the level of numinosity, that is this sort of glowing sacrality. Many have been recorded in the earliest religious scriptures. There are many things in the Judeo-Christian Bible, if we want to call that the Hebrew scriptures, and also, I don't know if there's any in the New Testament, but there certainly are many in the history of all the different religions. And we'll look at that, and we'll also look at, there's a wonderful scholar who's written a lot about dreams, who's very much scientifically oriented, but also is sensitive and open to Jungian ideas, which is very unusual. His name is Kelly Bulkley, and he sees big dreams as being at the roots and the origin of all religions. So we're going to look at a lot of different ways that big dreams are important culturally, and this will relate to what we've already been studying throughout the course about dreams and their individual significance for the dreamer. And that is pretty much what we'll be covering in the course. If you found what I've been talking about here interesting, I hope you do decide to enroll in Jung and Dreams, and I look forward to seeing you in that course.